right, we have Manoj Garg with us today. And what we're going to be talking about is business performance through information technology leadership. And I didn't just make that title up, that is actually the subtitle of a book that he has published called The Edge, with the subtitle being Business Performance Through Information Technology Leadership. One of the things that I think everybody in IT always fights against is that many companies view information technology as a cost center. And so when budgets need to be reduced, the first thing that finance does, I know this because I used to be in finance, is try to figure out where can they trim expenditures. And since IT expenditures can sometimes be large, IT departments are always fighting against trying to justify their growth investments, et cetera. And that's one of the things that Manoj tackles in his book and in his business. So anyway, Manoj, please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. This is Manoj Garg. I am the managing partner of Virtual Information Executives, a company that my colleagues and I started about 15 years ago as sort of an answer to the question of how do mid-sized companies that don't really have chief information officers figure out how to get the most value out of their IT investments. So that's who I am, and I'm looking forward to this conversation with you, Doug. Thank you.
On the one hand, there's a view that information technology is basically table stakes, right? Everybody needs to have their IT stuff in place. So some people try to get that done as inexpensively as possible. But when it's done right, your technology really can become a competitive advantage. Yet comparatively few companies, even large companies, really get to the point where that's the case. What's your observation as to why that happens? Because it seems like it's a conclusion that a lot of people should be able to figure out.
Yeah, I have worked with about 150 companies, I would say, as clients over the last 15 years. And you're right, there is sort of a pattern that implies the statement that you just made about how people like to treat IT as a back office function. But what I've also found is that there is sort of a variation in industry types and also the attitudes of the C level within the company that seems to dictate how they really view technology. Mostly, what I would say is a lack of education within business leadership about what technology can really do. Because in most cases, these folks have business backgrounds such as marketing, sales, and haven't really had a lot of opportunity, especially in the mid-sized companies and the smaller
Mhm.
companies, to really work with technology to really take advantage of the things that are possible. And I'm going to talk about a few of those. And so
Yeah,
when they
please
have
do.
these varying attitudes, part of our role is to work with them to educate them about what is possible. And that's a big part of what we do is to educate them about what is possible with IT in their particular
Yeah.
industry, in their particular business, and work with them to improve their investment portfolio. And we do coach them how to look about IT investments of the investment portfolio because there are about four or five different parts of IT and they're managed differently, just as you would in a financial portfolio. And so that's what we try to do is to help them understand the value of the various parts and how to invest in a combination that makes sense for them.
Well, okay. So in that case, you just teased it really well. Let me know what the five parts are.
Yeah, so there was a study done by this place called the Center for Information Systems Research at MIT. There was a paper published about 15 years ago by Well and Ariel. And I'm going to talk a little bit about
Hmm.
this paper, which is where I got most of these ideas from. They talk about the four parts of IT investments. The first part being IT infrastructure, which is a little bit like sort of the power in the house. You only notice it when it's gone. Otherwise, you don't even think about it. It has to be there for everything else to work. So that's first part of IT that you have to invest in. The second part might be termed the transactional layer. These are all your business application systems that enable business and automate your business processes. The third one might be the business intelligence layer, the one where all of the data from your enterprise comes together and helps you understand sort of your business metrics, sort of your future direction, sort of how you're performing in sales, in profitability, all the different metrics that matter to your business. That data can only be generated if you have the right systems generating that data for you, the second layer. So this is the third layer, the data layer. And the fourth might be considered to be strategic investments in IT enabled projects that enable new products, new markets, new services for the company from a revenue generation perspective. So they did a study across a couple hundred companies and they found that the companies that extract the most value from IT spend about 44% of their IT dollars on infrastructure. Now, that's a pretty large percentage if you would think about it. Okay, but it's probably not the one that you would manage as an investment. It's really managed more like an expense. You mentioned, Doug, about how like people like to manage IT as a back office expense.
Yes.
Well, that part surely is an expense because the way you manage that is that you figure out what's the minimum quality infrastructure that I really need for this company. And the answer can vary between a manufacturing company, which might be lower quality, versus a financial services company, which might be higher
Yeah.
quality, like banking. They need a high quality infrastructure to run all the stuff they run. Once you decide what quality you need, you go shopping and you buy the cheapest stuff you can find of that quality. So it is managed at an expense. However, the next layer up, the layer two, the transactional systems, that's a different equation completely. For every dollar that you spend in those systems, you might actually get $2 back as an ROI in transactional costs or even in automation efficiencies. So how you would invest in that is different, and you might want to spend more money in order to get more ROI from those type of investments.
Hmm.
The third one being the data layer or the informational layer. Can we put a value on that? I don't know if you can. The value of decision making in the company, that's really high value. And the final one most people ignore, which is what can we play with? What new things can we play with to enable revenue in the future? So what they found is that we have to invest in all of these four parts in a certain percentage,
Uh-huh.
44% for the first one, 22% for the second one, about 17% for the third one, and the remaining 11% or so for the fourth one in order to get the best portfolio for IT investments.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Well, there's a couple of things I think I just heard you say that I think are really important. The one is that I'm viewing those layers as a dependent chain. So in other words, it's like you said, there's 44% gets spent on infrastructure. The reason why is that, as you said, if the power doesn't work, then nothing else works. And it's really easy for infrastructure to become obsolete. And it's really easy to just kind of keep delaying the upgrades, but then eventually you'll have to do a whole bunch of upgrades at once and it'll shut down everything else that you're doing. I know because I've lived through this. I'm sure you have also. And but the thing that I heard that I think is really, really important is that you have to put that foundational piece together and really invest time in getting it right in order to be able to build on top of it to be able to get the value layers. And just the other observation, at least that I've had from my career, is that I think the thing that inhibits a lot of companies from putting that higher level value layer together is they'll put a whole bunch of money into something like an enterprise resource planning or ERP system, something like SAP or Oracle or one of the others. And what'll end up happening is it'll be a highly complex boondoggle. In other words, it'll be really, really expensive and it'll end up being so difficult to use that a lot of people will end up using manual processes for their business intelligence. So then what they'll do is they'll incorrectly figure that, well, their BI is the same after they've made this giant IT investment as it was before, because they're not really using the IT investment for BI. They're basically using it to as a SOX compliance system, an extremely expensive SOX compliance system, because it was overcomplicated. Now, that's been my observation, and I think that's a big impediment that a lot of companies run into. With that said, I'm only one person, and one is not that many data points. So let me know what you've seen and poke holes in my theory.
No, no, you're absolutely correct, Doug, in that when you talk about failed IT projects, and I think we've had probably the biggest failed IT project in Oregon when we tried to implement the medical Obamacare
Yeah.
system here, the $400 million failure.
Oregon wasn't alone that way. There were a lot of states that had
There were quite
failed
a few.
IT
There were
projects.
quite a few. But when we talk about failed IT projects, we are basically talking about a failed ERP type implementation. And that I think is the biggest risk area for especially a mid-sized business that
Hmm.
doesn't have the resources to really bring to bear on a project of this complexity and size. And so what tends to happen is that they tend to pick something that seems right, something they read about in a magazine or somebody told them it was a good system. They bring it in and it meets maybe 40% of the needs that they really have in the company from a business process point of view and a business functions point of view. And after they get done implementing, because implementations are hard and change management is really hard, maybe they implement half of what they bought. So now we're down to like 20% of the value. And of the half that they bought, the change management part is so poorly implemented and people don't get the training that they need to use the system correctly. The overall ROI, as you can imagine, is very, very poor.
Yep.
So that's what we find in a lot of our clients is that the biggest problem seems to be that these application systems, ERP systems, whatever you want to call it, are not purchased properly. They're not implemented properly because they didn't really have the expertise to follow what we consider to be the proper process. And you need a lot of expertise on the business side as well as on the technology side and experience with these type of systems to be able to do that correctly. The simple steps are that you got to write down the requirements that the company really has, and you got to marry that to a reasonable system that's out there, knowing that you're really only going to get 80% of what you want, and you're going to have to come up a way to fill in the gap with the remaining 20%. And then you have to follow the right process to implement it and the change management with the business guys supporting the implementation. Because if the business guys walk away, nothing is going to work anyway.
right?
When you do all that right, is when you get a reasonable ROI on that investment. And that's a big part of what we help our clients with.
Gotcha, gotcha. Well, and I think that makes sense. And that requirement part, I just want to unpack that a little bit because I was involved in an ERP project when I was at Intel, and it's long enough now to where a lot of the people are in different groups now. So I don't think I'm necessarily impugning anybody, but I think our team, we had instructions to go out and talk with all our business stakeholders and collect all their requirements. We had a list of, I think, like 250. It might have been more than that. We might have had over 500 business requirements, which of course is nonsense. The only way you can make something that meets like 500 business requirements is to make it ridiculously complicated, which of course is what we did. And the usability was near zero. The performance was terrible. The complexity was high. People didn't know what to do. It was really buggy. It required custom code. And so I would think in addition to collecting the business requirements, you also have to be really ruthless about prioritizing your business requirements and figure out which of these are really, 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 really important, and then which other ones are flexible. And I think that's the conversation that nobody wants to have, because in people's mind, what they think is, I want to implement a system, and what I want to do is I want to have the system be set up so that nobody has to change anything, which of course never happens. But in people's mind, that's what they want. And so that makes systems that are highly complex and ultimately are impossible to maintain. Has that been your observation also?
In part, I would say, yes, people do tend to go off maybe on the other side of the list of requirements when perhaps you're a large company like Intel or someone like that.
Hmm.
However, the clientele that we work with, they make a mistake on the other end of it. They don't write down requirements and they just go pick a system without really going through the process. So the right answer, I think, is sort of in the middle of
Yep.
what you brought up versus what I see, which is that if you have a couple of categories of requirements, usability being a key one, technology implications being another one, business functional requirements being another one. When you have four or five of these categories and you collect sort of the right number of requirements that are absolutely critical, and as you mentioned, you prioritize them so that when you go selecting a product, you know which ones are absolutely essential and which ones you can sort of look the other way on when you're comparing products. When you have this process with that middle ground, so to speak, you can end up with a much better outcome than you can if you were to not follow that process. There's a lot of experience that goes along with this kind of thing, doing it right.
Hmm.
And if you don't have that experience, if you haven't done this a dozen times before, it's really hard to make the right decisions when it comes to how much requirements do I write down? How do I prioritize them correctly? Which business guys do I have to talk to know which ones are critical and which ones are not? What systems can I look for out there in this category? Who can I believe when the software vendors make promises? Who can I believe? Who can I not believe? Because software vendors will promise you everything.
Yes, of course. And the implementation consultants come in and they'll just run the clock.
Yeah, the whole process of selecting the right system is an error prone process like you wouldn't believe it. And so doing that right gets you better ROI in general.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yes. And I think that's just kind of something I'd like to unpack a little more, is that the way the incentive structure is set up with a lot of these system deployments is that, of course, both the software vendor and the implementation partners are incentivized to make things as complicated as possible, because the vendor will be able to sell more licenses and the implementation partners will be able to rack up more billable hours. But of course, that long-term scenario, that's a recipe for disaster, but that's how the incentive structure is set up. How do you overcome that?
So we have to negotiate. This is the other part of what we sort of do towards the end of our relationship with our client, perhaps, is to help them find the right partner. Different partners want different types of compensation or incentives.
Hmm.
The right partner, however, wants to really partner with you to do what is right, okay, which may not be to implement every single technical requirement that you may have, but perhaps do it in phases. So breaking the project down in phases, phase one, phase two, phase three, sort of phase one being sort of the basic core modules of what you really need, phase two being sort of the next set, and phase three being the final set. And each of these phases could take up to 2 years to do right. And working with the implementation partner who has the patience to work with you through this,
Hmm.
and they might not get all their money in the first year, but maybe over 3 or 4 years is the key, I think. There are quite a few partners to choose from out there. And that's one of the things we help our clients with is to choose the right partner, who is a true partner, as opposed to someone who just wants money upfront.
Yeah, got it. And I think that's really a key a key element because yeah, the wrong partner, somebody who's just trying to rack up billable hours, it's you're going to end up with something that's too complicated.
That's exactly what happened at the state of Oregon with that Obamacare
Yeah,
issue. If you look at the details of that, that's what I hate to name names, but that's what Oracle was doing
yeah,
with the whole contract. They were just trying to rack up the hours, even though the change management part on the other end wasn't accepting all those changes and all the things that they wanted. And ultimately, the whole thing just blew up.
yeah. 'Cause every time you hear about like these tremendously expensive projects, a lot of, I think people who aren't in the industry would think, okay, how could a project possibly get that expensive? Well, what ends up happening is you'll have the software, which is usually has a pretty known cost, but then you have the cost of all of the implementation people that you have to start working in. Well, as timelines extend, then you have more billable hours. As you have to go through more change management, you have more billable hours. As you have to go back and redo things, it just keeps compounding. It's like these Hollywood films that get these really really high costs. Usually it's because there's something or a lot of things that you had to do over again.
One of the critical things that I think every implementation partner must be checked out on is references. And in the references, we ask the other client, hey, did they try to force things down your throat or did they work with you with some patience? And that's pretty revealing on the different attitudes of the different partners.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, let's take this. Let's take a little bit of a pivot here. And so we've been talking about some of the stumbles and roadblocks you can get to in creating technology value. Paint me a picture of what you've seen from some companies that have really done it well, and how this has created that competitive advantage. We've talked about all the ways that we can have problems. Let's talk about some of the ways
Sure,
where things can can create value.
sure. It's a pretty classic answer on my side. If you are a business, you must have a business strategy. Otherwise, you're just ambling along
Yeah.
and doing what's the next thing tactically. Most of the clients who are able to take advantage of technology are the
Hmm.
ones who have a pretty decent written down business strategy that then they ask us to develop a IT strategy for that is aligned to the business strategy. So when we have access to a written strategy, let's say a 30, 40 page document that talks about the markets they're going after, the products and services that they want to either expand or introduce to these markets, that gives us a pretty good idea about the business processes that they currently have or will want to have as they grow. Let's take a manufacturing example.
Hmm.
One of our clients was a beer maker in Oregon somewhere. I won't name the city. And they were looking to grow from a $75 million company to a $250 million company.
That's quite a bit of
In
growth.
order to do that, they had to introduce new beers, new products, new lines of service, a new manufacturing facility on the East Coast as well. So to do all of that, they had a nice 15, 20 page set of PowerPoint slides that explained all the things that they wanted to do. So when we completed the IT assessment for them, it was pretty obvious, even today, where some of the gaps really were. There were some gaps in the marketing process of how they worked with stores that provide incentives for the beer to move faster, some other things like that. We had to fix those as basic things because in order to have more volume and move faster ahead of the competitors, you got to have your basic marketing stuff working, your basic sales, supply chain working, right?
Hmm. Well,
So,
and because I
so
think that one of the things I'm hearing that I think is really important for people to remember is that what good IT is going to be able to tell you is when you're doing pricing, promotion, marketing, etc., it'll be able to tell you how effective is that and where can you follow the old adage, right? Do more of what's working and less of what isn't. If you don't have visibility to your data, you don't know and you're shooting blind.
Exactly. That's the third layer that I mentioned before, the data layer and the business intelligence layer. So when you have that working correctly for your company, whatever it happens to be, in this case, that part was critical. You know, the pricing strategy, the marketing strategy, the move the product faster strategy ahead of the competitor was all dependent on this data coming back from the stores. And so when they improved that function, things as they were got a whole lot better. The other part they had some challenges with was efficiency in the manufacturing process with wastage, breakage, that kind of thing. So once they resolved that and we understood what the future was going to look like in terms of their growth cycle, we were able to put together a technology strategy plan for them for the next 3 to 5 years that included expansion to the new manufacturing facility in the East Coast, as well as expansion of their staff to do some of the more complex functions of business systems analysis, new ways of doing things, maybe bringing in new systems to automate more functions within the manufacturing process, and so on. So once we understand where the business is going, I think IT can put together their own plan for
Hmm.
how technology is going to be brought into the company in different phases. Because remember, it takes time to implement technology projects. It can take a year or two or three to do it right, especially with the change management that can be sort of slow. So when you have a better business plan, you can have a better technology plan. You can have better execution of it. You can have better investment pricing for the technology that you do buy, and overall, because you have the right stuff in the technology portfolio, you're going to get a better ROI. One of the things that we also teach our clients is to how to measure the ROI from an IT investment
Oh, interesting.
portfolio.
Yeah,
We have a
unpack that
standard
for us.
dashboard for how we do that. You know, there's a project management part, is a project delivering value. There's infrastructure part, is infrastructure delivering value. All the different parts that are supposed to deliver value. We can customize that for clients so that they now have a way to measure, are we getting value or not? Whereas before they were flying blind,
Hmm.
essentially. So all of that can enable a mid-sized company to grow more efficiently as well as get more value out of their portfolio.
Yeah, well, and I think that's at least to me, that's really where a lot of it comes from is being able to grow efficiently, because the ideally what you want to be able to do is you want to be able to to scale and grow without needing to solve every problem by adding headcount. And not that I'm against having people, but headcount is expensive. And what a lot of companies do when they're going through a rapid growth phase is they don't necessarily feel like they have time to put in the systems and processes to be able to handle problems with technologies, so they do that with adding people. That's fine, solves a problem, people figure it out. It's usually messy, they call that human glue. But the problem that you'll run into is eventually when you hit your growth targets, now you have a very expensive cost structure, and you could be looking at a long-term profitability crunch if you haven't grown effectively. And I think that's one of the things that's a gap that frequently gets missed, is that making
Yeah,
sure to really have your technology dialed in is the way that you can avoid a major cost problem as you go through growth.
absolutely, Doug. I completely agree with that statement. Over the years, working with a number of different clients in a number of different industries, I've noticed that the point where they decide that they need to do something about their technology seems to vary just a little bit. You know, maybe for a company, it's going to be around the $20 million revenue mark. For another company, it might be around the $50 million revenue mark when they notice that there's going to be a big step function to get to the next level. And so technology is going to play a big part in that efficient growth
Hmm.
as opposed to just bringing in more people. Maybe they can bring in more technology, which over the long haul will be more cost effective for them. And that's the point usually where we come in and help them figure that out because they don't really have an internal CIO who's done this before. But that's who we are as fractional CIOs to help them through that whole process in their growth life.
Well, and let's actually just kind of come back to the idea of the CIO or fractional CIO, because I think what we've been talking about today is really what you really need your CIO to do. And because at least I've observed that in a number of companies, the CIO is primarily a technologist, which I think is partway there, but I think of a CIO as more of a business person than a technologist, because, and I think there's, at least that's one of the things I've seen, is there's a heavy emphasis on the technology side, But if you're a technologist without a business focus, you'll just end up spiraling your cost structure.
Correct. So the word CIO has been used in a lot of different ways in the industry to date, especially because the IT industry is a younger industry when compared to most of the other disciplines within
Yep.
business. That word is thrown around a lot. I've seen companies of 10 people in IT that call their IT leader CIO, but that's not really what I would call a true CIO. So here's the definition of a CIO versus an IT director versus an IT manager that I find to be reasonably practical. The CIO spends 80% of their time being part of the executive committee
Hmm.
and worrying about business concerns, growth, new revenue targets, new ways to new ways to make things more efficient, things like that. Now, a CIO is definitely someone who's going to come from a technology background, but have come up the ranks, probably have an MBA, if that makes any sense, have learned on the business side,
Yep.
have learned their industry in particular, and can speak the exact same language of their executive peers. Okay, so that's the CIO. 80% of their time is spent on business concerns and being part of the CEO's inner circle. However, an IT director, I would say, spends probably 10 to 20% of their time on those concerns, but 80% of their time on IT operational concerns.
Yep.
Okay, and by operational concerns, you know what I mean. Make sure the security is right, make sure the servers are right, make sure the applications are working, all that kind of stuff. So naturally, they're not going to have enough time to really focus on the business side of things, and they tend to be viewed more as a technologist by the rest of the executives, and typically doesn't get invited to the roundtable, as it were. And so that creates a challenge for this IT director. However, in a mid-sized company, they can't really afford now that they need a full-time CIO
Yep.
because CIOs tend to make a lot more money and typically have IT staff of 100 people or more in my book. Okay, so we've got this gap in the mid-market. So how do we fill a gap like that typically for better expertise? We tend to bring in consultants
Yep.
to fill that gap when we can't afford a full-time person.
Yeah. And
So that's where I see, people like us coming in, ex-CIOs who can assist on a part-time basis. But the companies that are going to be better off are the ones that realize that technology in their company is basically technology. It's not thinking ahead. It's not thinking strategically or whatever. The IT leader is more concerned with technology issues as opposed to business issues. But maybe what they need is to bring somebody else in to think about that for a little
mhm.
while to help them get on the right track for the future. And so that's how I see the difference between a CIO and a technologist, IT director.
Yeah, and I think there's a use case that I was just thinking of while you were talking that I think is important. Also, is that in a lot of smaller or mid-sized companies, yeah, not only can they not afford to have a full-time CIO, there's just too many operational things that need to happen to be able to have that be 80% of somebody's job. And I think that's probably if anything, I would think that's your primary consideration is that if it is as much as people talk about needing to be tactical and strategic at the same time, you can't. Humans aren't able to multitask as much as we try to pretend. There's you can shift, but you can't juggle two priorities at the same time. And so I think that when you have internal resources that are wholly dedicated to operational priorities and you're not yet at the size where you can dedicate someone primarily to business priorities, I think that's the kind of situation where you almost be doing a disservice to your company and your people by trying to internally drive it, because you need to be able to detach from the daily operations in order to really align what you're doing with your business.
The dynamic in my mind that speaks to this a little bit, Doug, in addition to what you said, is that when you have, depending on the industry, when you have different companies that are growing from a certain size to a certain stage to the next stage, etc. In the initial stages, they're more concerned about other issues than IT.
Hmm. Yes.
Okay, because what is the role of IT? There's a role that has to do with basic stuff like email and laptops and cell phones and stuff like that. But then the next role of IT really is business automation, right?
Yep.
But in smaller companies, business automation may not be as important as the ones that are looking to grow to the next level and become really big, like a $100 million
Hmm.
company, $500 million company. So what they tend to do at the initial stages is they sort of ignore the IT part because they have other concerns like sales, like marketing, like supply chain issues, like those kind of issues to worry about more. And having limited resources, they tend to take the easy way out on the IT side. They have They buy QuickBooks for a financial system. They'll buy a few servers to get email or something from the cloud, and they might have a guy in IT managing some of these things who is basically a technologist. Okay, but when you get to a certain level, say in the manufacturing industry,
Hmm.
you get up to a $50 million company. You realize that to get from 50 to 250, if that's your goal, okay, you are going to have to now worry about technology, because technology now will play a big part in your efficient growth. Until now, you have been able to afford to ignore it because you had other concerns, but now it's going to be a key part of the equation. So that's when you start to think about it, invest some more, think about your IT leader, maybe bring in a part-time CIO to come in and help. So I see that dynamic quite a lot as smaller companies get along and they're okay, they're fine.
Yep.
They have other concerns. But when they get up to a certain level is when they now need to worry about investments in IT, because the bigger IT systems, they have sort of a minimum cost and a minimum point of entry cost that only the slightly larger companies can afford it, even now. So
Yep.
that's a dynamic that I see where it's a certain size that needs us more than others.
Got it. Got it. Boy, we've had a great conversation about how to, how to really use technology for creating business value. Just let me ask you: is there a question that I should have asked but I didn't? Is there a blind spot that we've missed?
I don't think so. No,
Okay,
I think we covered most of the ground on this. I mean, there's a lot more that can be
of
said,
course.
of course, but I think for today's about 40 minutes or so, I think that's good.
All right, excellent. Well, okay, so Manoj, just give us your last one to two thoughts then, and then let everybody listening know where they can get a hold of you.
At my point in my life right now, I'm just looking to help people and companies with what I know. So I love talking about technology. I love talking about business. And anybody who wants to reach out to me to discuss these kind of topics, please feel free to call on me. And the way to reach me, my phone number is 503-348-2510. My email address is mgarg@viellc.com. I welcome your comments, I welcome your questions, and I welcome the discussion on these topics.
Outstanding,
Thank
excellent.
you, Doug.
Well, hey Manoj, really appreciate your time today.